For today's webinar, we have Inspector John Bowen, Assistant Division Commander with the Michigan State Police Forensic Science Division, presenting Developing Critical Thinking Skills via Tabletop Exercises. Without further delay, here's John.
Okay, thank you. Hello, my name is John Bowen, and I'm going to talk to you today about developing critical thinking skills through tabletop exercises. I'm an inspector with the Michigan State Police Forensic Science Division, and I'm currently responsible for operations of our laboratory systems, 7 labs, roughly 260 people in 7, really 8 disciplines of forensic science. Before I get too far into this, I just wanted to mention that I'm really not an expert in emergency management planning or operational emergency planning. This is something that developed somewhat organically in our system due to a few conversations that we had internally and a realization that we really just were not well prepared for the kinds of emergencies or contingencies that can come up and things that just were not well addressed in policy. There are many of you out there who probably have access to people who actually are experts in this kind of planning. Emergency management folks, I think especially, are very good at tabletop exercises and that sort of planning. If you have those folks available to you, or maybe if you have that kind of training, you may already be on a very good foot and be ready to move forward, aside from what I'm going to talk about today. So what led us to this? As I mentioned, I'm responsible for operations of Forensic Science Division in Michigan. We have 7 laboratories geographically spread around the state. I'm responsible for operations of those labs, but I don't really have sort of quote unquote control of them. They run pretty independently. Each has its own laboratory director. And for the most part, I'm available to consult with them if they have difficulties or emergencies, but my hope and expectation is that they're able to handle things locally when they come up. We also don't have great, what I'll call operational training in Michigan for people. So we have a lot of leadership training, obviously a lot of technical training in forensic science, but that sort of in the moment operational decision-making training isn't something that we get a lot of. And it's one of those things that you can learn with experience, of course, but maybe half that experience isn't always good experience depending on the situations you run into. So we don't have that kind of training available to us very much. It's hard to know how people are going to react when they're put under stress and making a difficult decision in the moment, and this seems to has held for us at least to be a good way to fill that training void. I joke with my team that I also want to be able to turn my phone off on vacations. It's maybe a half joke, but I think it's probably a pretty common thread, maybe especially in forensic science labs where we're used to being hands-on. It's a good way to build confidence, not just in a team, but in yourself, that your team is going to be able to manage without you around. So why would you do this? I think there are a few reasons here. The entry point is very low. It's literally no expense except for travel to get people into the same room. It does introduce sort of a challenge to your management team. And I should mention, I'm approaching this as from the perspective of maybe a sort of senior level manager working with a management team that's sort of quote unquote below them in the chain of command, and trying to build that team up, to build up their expertise. So it's a challenge for your team. It helps build trust in that team, so that I mentioned that on the previous slide, you can trust them to make good calls in your absence more quickly and without your sort of authority or vote. It's safe. There's no risk in these exercises. Everything is fictitious, so there's no real pressure. There are no consequences to a poor choice. And it also is very easy. You can easily fit this into a 1-hour meeting. Most of these take much less than 1 hour. So that again makes that entry point very, very low. What will my agency gain? So some of you may have to justify this sort of deviation. this kind of an activity with your agencies. I think these are valid things that an agency can gain from the management team getting involved in this type of exercise. You will find weaknesses in your own policies and procedures. It'll just naturally happen as you start the discussion and start to move through the exercise. You'll see glaring gaps in what you think are pretty strong policies already. You'll also be able to clarify authority in decision making. This is an important one, I think, and we've seen a couple examples of this in Michigan doing these exercises, where you suddenly realize, or you suddenly start to wonder if the person who's central in the moment has the authority to make the decision, or do they believe they have the authority? Maybe you think they do, but they don't think they do. So it's a good chance to clarify those roles and identify who's responsible and who is expected to make decisions. It also gives you a chance to validate disaster recovery plans. And for many of us, maybe disaster recovery, initially what we think of are IT recovery plans. So when your computer systems go down, what's the disaster recovery plan for that? It can be that. It can also be other things. If the building is compromised, how do you recover from that? How do you sort of reoccupy a building after it's been compromised? So if you have plans out there for those types of things, this exercise can validate that plan, and it can also help you tighten it up if there are gaps in it. The inefficiencies in the decision-making tree, I sort of alluded to this, I think, on the second point of the slide. Sometimes what we find are people don't realize the authority is theirs to make a decision, and they want to ask sort of up the chain for clarification or for help. Or sometimes someone up the chain insists that they have to be involved in the decision-making process for certain things, and you can help clarify that a little bit with this process. Sometimes you'll recognize that you really don't need someone further up the chain to make a decision when the choice is quite obvious based on certain circumstances. So we'll get to that a little bit too. And then lastly, not least important, but last, is you'll actually speed up your agency's response in real time when an emergency does come up. Okay, what will my team and I gain? So I think this is a good one. This is, to me, most important. This slide, in general, is most important. You'll get a better understanding of what your team's capabilities are. Now, as you're sitting there listening to me, you can think through who your team members are, and you know what some of their strengths and weaknesses are. You know who needs the most specific direction to do something you ask, and you know others who you can just hand off a general topic to, and they'll just get it taken care of. This will help clarify that. It'll help give you a better understanding of how your team will react in stressful situations, especially. At the same time, it also empowers that team to be more confident and to better understand what your expectations are. So I think it's a non-confrontational way to get them to understand what you would want to happen in an emergency. Because in my experience, at least, a few times I thought we were heading toward a pretty obvious outcome, and I saw people at the meeting table looking at me as if they expected me to decide. And to me, it was a pretty clear moment where I would have expected them to choose at their level. So you can help clarify expectations with that, with this exercise system as well. That all serves to build the team up naturally, of course. They start to trust each other more and help to understand each other more, and there's a certain positive reinforcement from the peer interaction, I think, when ideas are suggested and people start to understand what their fellow lab directors, for example, across the state think in a situation or how they think. Of course, all this serves to help you trust them to make decisions on their own. That's the goal for me, at least, is that I hear about it after the decisions are made and good things have come of it. And then, of course, as I mentioned a couple of times now, this also helps set expectations for them and let them know exactly what decisions you want them to make and what when are the moments when they should be coming to you or to someone else for clarification. planning for this type of exercise is really, really simple. It does not take very long. I typically do this with a very short PowerPoint presentation, so sort of one slide for each thing, and I'll explain what those things are next. But essentially, you need to pick a topic or a scenario. Start with something simple. Don't pick a huge, sort of a huge disastrous starting point. So, for example, maybe if the entire power grid for your region of the country went down, well, that's kind of a disaster. That's kind of a end game. So there's not a lot of direction to go from there. But if you pick something smaller, maybe the power in the building goes out, you can start working that way and make decisions on what your operational capability is going to be as you work through that scenario. So don't limit yourself to real world or likely things. So what I mean by that is don't feel bad about getting a little bit crazy with the concept you throw out, the scenario that you throw out. It doesn't have to be super realistic. I think sort of stretching everyone's thought process is maybe even easier if the scenario is so far-fetched that it doesn't feel like anything that they've seen before and have managed through before. So that's the general first step. The second step is just to think of a list of complications that you could throw at that initial topic. So the idea here is you're going to talk about a topic, you're going to let the group talk about the topic, and then you're going to start throwing complications at it one at a time and asking them to work through those complications and see if the direction changes as you move through the problem. Okay, this slide we're going to actually go through the entire process of how to execute these exercises. So step one, really get them all in the room together. Could you do this remotely? Yes, I think you can. I think in the room together is better, especially for this type of exercise, because you want to be able to see their faces, to see who's actually interacting. Of course, sometimes the overlapping voices in the conference room are good. I think it adds to the stress of it a little bit, maybe. Of course, on a Teams chat or a Zoom call or something, some people have their microphones muted, maybe their cameras are on, or maybe they're not. They're sort of looking at their email on the side. You don't entirely have their focus. So I think it's better to be in the room together. It can just be a small conference room. It does not have to be anything extravagant. The second step is to set them up with instructions. You want to ask them to take the exercise seriously, but don't get too stressed out about it. You don't really need people taking notes. You certainly don't want multiple people in the room focusing on taking notes. We have found during our exercises, there were a couple points where it was important to sort of pause and ask one person to write down something to follow up on later. So a policy gap, for example, that we want to address, that might be a good idea to have someone assigned as a note taker for those sorts of things to write down important bullet items. But overall, you're just asking them to sort of pretend this is real and that we have to make decisions on how to move forward through the problem. So then you just give them the main scenario. As I said, I usually start with a PowerPoint presentation and I just type out the sort of the main idea or the main scenario on the first slide and let them read that. From there, it's just a discussion. So, and I try to stay out of the discussion as much as I can, but ask them to discuss as a group and decide how best to handle it. Do we have the authority? Do they have the authority to make the decision? Should they be reaching out to someone, or do they need other resources, or do they need other information before they can make a choice? What are the outcomes, good, bad, and otherwise, that are likely from the choice? And then is there any kind of a communication plan needed? Whether it's to notify me or someone else in the chain of command, or any other stakeholders, or even their own staff, to notify them of what's going on and what the plan will be to help staff understand how to move through the emergency. One thing I try to do, though, is don't let them defer to another authority. And what I mean by that is sometimes in these scenarios, it's pretty easy to go, well, this decision is beyond our control. We'd have to defer, 2 or 3 layers up the chain of command and wait for someone to decide for us. Well, that kills the exercise immediately, right? And I think it's a sort of an easy way out. There's also a very good chance, though, a very real chance that higher authority that the group decides to just appeal to or wait for has no idea. how to make that decision, and they don't have the information that you do right in front of you anyway. So I think it, aside from sort of ending the exercise abruptly, I think it's good to do this anyway because it lends to that first one of those concepts that I mentioned earlier, which is deciding where in the chain decisions need to be made and finding that decision-making efficiency. So this helps with that if you don't let them defer to someone else. So after, it can be 3 to 15 minutes of deliberation and decision-making and debate about what the right choice is, then you just add a twist to the scenario, and then go back to steps 4 through 6, back to deliberation, back to decide, does this change our direction at all? Do we need to do something different now? Or is this, is our current decision path appropriate? Okay, next, I'm going to walk through a couple of examples that we've used here in Michigan. These are just some seeds for ideas that you can use, and I've got a list of more ideas after these 2 examples. So, you don't need to write this down necessarily right now, but the cyber attack scenario. So before I give this to you, there is a little context that's important for the scenario as we ran it in Michigan. One of those bits of context is we have a lab case management system, a digital one, that we use universally across all of our labs. So all 7 labs, all 260, whatever people, we use it for everything in our process. So case and evidence reception, evidence chain of custody tracking, results tracking, report production, report delivery. It's all done electronically and via our lab case management system, our LCMS. So that's an important important bit of context for this. If your system is different, if you have a paper-based system, then obviously this is a slightly different, maybe the scope of this problem is slightly different for you. But for us, this is my starting premise. You come in this morning and you realize that our lab case management system is down. The database on the back end has something wrong with it, and the IT folks are working on it. So in our system, this is not uncommon. Our staff recognize this problem right away because we've had our database go down multiple times in the past, right? So the sort of standard answer to this one as well, we don't know how long it's going to be down, but let's just wait it out. We can wait a few hours or a half a day if we have to. It's painful and it hurts the operation, but there's not much else we can do. And it's not painful enough that we should do drastic things to overcome it. So this would be my first complication of that problem. So after that discussion of the initial premise, what do we do? What should we do? Now I'll throw in, well, actually it's going to take 24 hours to recover. That's what the IT guys are saying. Does that change our attack? Does that change what we do? Are we okay waiting for the whole system to come back online in 24 hours? We lose a whole day of productivity across the state. And the rest of these bullet points are just going to be further complications or further twists, if you will, in that initial concept. So after 24 hours, the IT guys come back and say, well, actually, it's going to be a week to recover. We have to rebuild the database. Now what happens? Can we afford for forensic science to be down for a whole week across the state? How do we handle that? Okay, the next complication, well, it turns out it's actually malware, and it's not just the database that our LCMS is attached to, but it's all of our computers. They're infecting across the network. So now the IT guys have shut down the network while they try to mitigate the problem and find the source of it and all that kind of thing. So now you have no computers essentially at all that you can use for any purpose, not just the lab case management system, but email and Word and all the things are gone. Right, so the next decision is all computers must be replaced and wiped. In our state, at least, we would know that means it's going to be a very long time before all those computers get replaced or wiped and refreshed. It's probably weeks to months anyway. I guess sort of coming out of that long nosedive, some weeks later, we would see, one computer that we can trust. So our IT folks have given us one computer that we know is clean. Here you go, forensic science. You have one computer for the state for all 7 of your labs that you can use and can believe in. Does that help us in some way to recover from not having any computers? Can we use one computer for some of our chain of custody issues or for emergency court cases or something like that. Okay, and then maybe getting a little bit better recovery here. Now we have one computer in each facility. So that would be for us 7 computers, one in each laboratory across the state. How does that help us? And how does that change what we can do next? And then last, now all computers are back online. So it's sort of back to the beginning, how things were when the first announcement was made about the database being down. And initially this might feel like the end of the exercise, but it could be pretty painful when everything comes back online after being down and gone for weeks or months. Now you may have, I don't know, maybe you have weeks and months of paper records that you somehow have to reintegrate to the data, to the digital versions of them in your LCMS. And of course, you still have work coming in the door today. So what resources are you going to use to sort of go back in history and integrate those records? And how will that look for your quality system and for record retention in the future? So that's the cyber attack model that I used. Again, you can decide your own basic premise, and you can decide what twists to throw in there. And it's probably a good idea to do that based on what your IT system looks like, who does your IT support, and what basically dream up ways that you can complicate the scenario for your team and make it sort of feel personal. Okay, the second example I was going to throw out for you here is a compromised facility. And this is one where I know I mentioned earlier that you can get a little bit outlandish with what the scenarios look like. And I think that's a valuable thing. I'll talk about that actually again at the end of this example, because this actually came home for us about 3 weeks after I presented this same content at ASCLD in 2022. So for this one, the facility is compromised by a local group that has threatened to attack one of our labs. So in our example, I said, well, there's some kind of a group in the state police intelligence folks have caught wind of this conversation happening in this group where one of our facilities is threatened for a physical attack. Essentially, one of our labs helped process evidence that took one of their members, sent one of their members to prison. So they're looking for retaliation. Okay, so after that initial discussion about what we should do, maybe the initial discussion is, maybe we tighten up how people move across the parking lots, how our staff move across the parking lots. We make sure that gates are locked. We double down on making sure that doors are secured and that people are keeping their heads up and paying attention in the parking lots to what's happening, so that no one is getting caught out. Now, this next bullet point, local PD arrested subject behind the lab. This is the first sort of complication that I threw at them. All right, so last night, during the night, the police department locally here around our lab caught somebody who was peeking in windows and sort of slinking around the building, and he's a member of that group. So that just took the sort of intellectual threat to more of a physical thing. Now people are actually on our property and looking at the building and admittedly trying to find weaknesses and ways to compromise the building. Now, what does that change for us? Then the next complication is a mysterious explosion that occurs against the exterior wall of one of our buildings. That obviously is a tremendous escalation, but we still have to decide what to do, right? We have evidence in that building. The building is compromised with a big hole in the wall, potentially a physical hole in the wall. So how do we secure the building? What about the evidence in there? Do we continue to try to do work in that building, or do we try to move people and evidence and equipment to another facility? What's our plan for that? Again, a further wrinkle here now, I threw in that the power was going to be out for at least 8 hours. So the explosion also knocked out the power, further complicating things, of course. And now the power company comes back and says, well, actually, instead of 8 hours, it's going to be 3 days before the power comes back up. So now you don't have lights or heat or air conditioning or even a sustained alarm system or intrusion system in the building for that much time. Okay, now physical security of the building will take 2 weeks to restore. So this is what I meant by the explosion knocked a hole in the side of the building. So it's going to take 2 weeks to get a contractor in there who can actually secure it in a way that makes sense and is safe enough to leave the building unoccupied. So I want to mention before I get too far into this slide, that example, that building compromised example, I presented this topic at ASCLD in 2022 here back in May. And then literally within a few weeks of that, we had one of our buildings attacked by a subject who was unhappy about something completely unrelated to us, but he essentially saw a government installation and decided to take it out on the building. It was after hours, and he chose to drive his vehicle into we have an external garage that houses our crime scene equipment, some other equipment and supplies and things. So it repeatedly bashed his vehicle into the garage, destroyed the door, compromised the wall, gained entry to the building, went in there and stole a laptop and some other items and essentially trashed the place. So much smaller scale than obviously this complicated mess of a slide that I put up for you here, but it really brought home the sort of just wild nature of what can happen. And we don't think of those things in a natural way because we just get into our routine of doing business and making decisions along the way. But this is far enough out there that staff can at least have a reference point to start with and how to make a decision and what needs to be done in that kind of situation. Okay, other ideas. I said I would give you a short list of ideas. There's a list here. Some of these are more environmental things. Those are pretty nice to start with because everybody can recognize those. I threw out explosion for you already in one detailed example. Tornado, approaching wildfire, depending on your part of the country. Those might make more or less sense for you. Threats of harm against employees. This one comes up maybe a couple times a year or something where we hear a story or we have our own story of someone getting threatening or getting loud in a courtroom or something and threatening a staff member or a police officer or something. So that's a pretty easy one to understand. Flooding in an evidence room, utility failures like the security system or the gas leaking in the building. Those kinds of things are good starting points too. And again, I would really encourage you, especially if you in your discussions with your teams, if you see something or hear something and think, oh man, we're really not prepared for that piece, or that if that really happened, that crazy thing came up, we would not be ready for that. That's probably a sign that you've got a really good topic right there where you could do this and pull that team together and sort of tabletop your way through it to try to plan for it. I think that kind of planning, again, similar to my building compromised example, you plan for one version of it, and when the real life version of it comes, your team is ready to go and they've got it handled. Okay, with that, I thank you for your time. I would like to take whatever questions you have available.
All righty, thank you, John, for providing such an informative presentation and those valuable examples. For today's Q&A session, we have guest moderator Nelson Santos, a principal scientist with RTI International. And yeah, if you have any questions, please submit them into the chat now.
Thank you, John, for that presentation. It's always interesting to hear doing things in a practical way and how that will impact how you respond in an emergency. I think it's a really cool way of handling something that normally is considered so drastic. So I've got a couple of questions here that are coming in. We've got about 30 minutes, folks, for any questions that you have. So please feel free to put those into the chat so we can answer them. So the first question I have is, do you memorialize the topics, discussion, and or decisions that result from these exercises?
Thanks. No, we really don't, at least not in a formal way. Sometimes, like I mentioned earlier in the presentation, there are tidbits that come out, of course, where you might find policies that need to be tightened up. So someone makes notes about those. So those can turn into policy improvements, but we don't keep meeting minutes or anything like that. Typically, these examples are going to be too specific, maybe too far-fetched that to be useful to pull out as a resource document later anyway. It's more about the mental challenge of it, I think, and just the learning makes sort of the mental expansion. That's the important piece for me.
So when you go through these exercises and you have, I guess you have managers and staff as well included in there, is it a group think type of exercise, or where the manager, let's say you put out the scenario and you put in a complication and the manager, let's say the lab director, says, does anybody have an idea? How does that go along? How does that dynamic happen?
Yeah, it's definitely a group discussion, and it's just sort of an open format. I mentioned that I try to stay out of it mostly because I've had time to think about the idea more, right? Because I'm the one writing up the scenario and the complications. So I've at least thought preliminarily about what I would want to do or what I think I would do in the moment. So I try not to inject that into the team's discussion, but instead just listen and let them throw out ideas to each other and let them either support or refute those ideas with other thoughts, and just sort of let it go where it goes. The goal really isn't to come up with the perfect solution at the end. There's no right or wrong or anything like that. So yeah, it's just sort of a free form, let it flow sort of a format.
Right. Another question for you. The audience member understands the scenarios and escalation in the scenarios, but wants to know more about how do you guide the discussion? How do you get away from everyone pointing fingers at each other or saying it's their job? Or as you said at the beginning, everyone just saying the higher up should make the decision.
So that's a good question. In the scenarios that I've laid out, primarily they are aimed at our laboratory directors. And so each of those lab directors has the same, obviously the same role, just in a different part of the state. So they understand, their team is going to be affected the same way as the other lab directors in the state. So it's not something they could easily escape and say, well, it's not really my problem to decide, it's somebody else's issue. The example I gave about the facility being compromised, in that one, I actually named a specific one of our facilities that was compromised in our scenario. And so the discussion was really about how do we support that lab and that lab director, and do we send additional people to that lab to help move evidence or to move equipment or to protect things, or do we deploy that lab's equipment and personnel to other laboratories? And so there was specific discussion about who's going to go where and which team is going to do what. So to that effect, I think that's important, because everybody has a piece in the solution, or everybody has a voice in what the potential solution is. So there really isn't escaping that. As far as preventing them from deferring up the chain, it doesn't happen a lot. And I tell them at the outset, I'm not going to let you defer up the chain. And so if they try, and it did happen once or twice, but they said something like, well, we need a governor's declaration on that or something. And I would say, well, the governor is in, she's in China doing some sort of a tour, so not available. We have to decide. So you can just sort of make those people unavailable in some way, and just keep the scenario moving.
Yeah, you've got control of the scenario, right? So you can actually put another twist in there. So, okay, another question came in. Are these exercises built into any sort of training program or regular schedule in your operation?
No, they're not. Initially, we've done, I think, 4 of them total here. And I just threw it out as an exercise. Again, the initial one was based on a crime scene response team issue that we had, a question that we had, where a couple of us realized there's a certain kind of complicated crime scene that we probably are not prepared to respond to, because we just had never encountered that before. So sort of as these scenarios come up, and we realize there's an opportunity to not only to improve our own policies, but to sort of teach ourselves quickly as we go and involve everyone in the decision. We just throw them out there. So no, there's no schedule.
Okay, here's a good question. Some of these scenarios can lead to hostile, emotionally charged responses. How and when do you intervene if and when participants are becoming emotional or defensive in these scenarios?
I haven't encountered that. I guess maybe that's, I suppose there's a way to de-escalate a little bit. If you don't, if you, well, you know your team, first of all, right? So you kind of have to gauge how difficult you can make those scenarios and how quickly to escalate with complications and how bad they're going to get. So you may have an understanding at the beginning about how well the team will be able to handle it. And maybe if you have, maybe this is what this question is addressing. If you have a pretty fledgling management team that you're doing this with, they may not have a clue with some of this stuff. So going to the really hard things might be too much too early. So maybe I would say start with simpler tasks and try to ease into it. Short of that, just trying to de-escalate, or someone's getting hostile or emotionally charged, maybe you can sort of call a timeout right in the middle of the exercise and take 5 for a restroom break or something and pull that person aside. I haven't had that experience with our team, so I'm not sure.
Well, in some ways it could serve as a learning point too, right? Because in real life that may happen. Mm-hmm. And that might be an opportunity to say, okay, time out. How would we handle this then if this really happened in real life? So that's an interesting dynamic that might actually really play out in real life.
I agree.
Yeah. All right. Let's see what we have here. In your opinion, is this best suited for an internal discussion only, or is there any value in having a third party facilitate this discussion?
I think there probably is some value if you could have a third party come in and facilitate. So, for example, in our case, if a third party came in, then I at least wouldn't necessarily know what the scenarios are going to be or what the complications are. So I'd at least be able to participate a little more. So that would be an interesting dynamic. Aside from that, I think the scenarios, at least the ones that we've used here, are customized enough for our environment, for our labs, that they're recognizable, or our staff says, oh, I know what lab you're talking about that was compromised, and I know how far it is from the Sterling Heights lab to the Lansing lab and those kinds of things. So it's a little more context because they're customized. And I think it'd be tough for a third party to customize scenarios in that way and make them fit our operation.
Okay, I'm getting a lot of questions about group size. It says, what about group size? Is this best done as a larger group versus smaller groups? If larger, what does that mean? 20 people, 50, 100?
So I have done this exercise, or these exercises, with our lab director team, our operational team, which is really 7 or sometimes 8 lab directors and myself. So let's say 10 or so people. And then also we've done one, the IT one that I laid out for you in detail. We did that one with all of our technical leadership present too. The quality assurance team was there. And that took our numbers up to roughly 20 or so people. I think that's probably getting close to the max for the number of people. And I only say that because when you get to that point, you start to lose people. It's easy to disappear in a crowd, and you can't get everyone engaged. You're not really testing everyone's thinking then if people can sort of hide. So I think smaller groups are probably better. I mean, typically, I think the ideal is probably whatever you have in your normal direct report span. So it's 2 or 3 or 5 or 7 people, something like that. It's probably the ideal, because that's where you're going to learn the most about your team.
Is there an ideal amount of time that these exercises should last?
I don't know. I think we haven't done any that have lasted over an hour, and that includes some discussion even after I'm done complicating the scenario and they're done talking about it. There's been sometimes 10 or 15 minutes more discussion, or going back to an earlier stage of the exercise and talking about something that was brought up there. I don't see it going more than an hour. Is that, ideally? I don't know if that's ideal or not, but I'd say 40 minutes or so is pretty good. You can pretty well flesh out a lot of what you know or don't know in that much time.
Yeah, this question here, I'll answer it. I'm not sure I understand it, but maybe does your department require people to take IS 100, 200, 700? I don't know if that's ISO, if that's a training. Maybe you understand the context of the question.
I'm not sure I do, but I think those are incident command classes.
Oh, okay.
Which probably goes to that formal emergency management training and wherein a lot of people do these tabletop exercises. We do, our department, our field personnel, so that's the troopers in the field that are responding to crimes and investigating them. There's a lot more of that out there. Incident command is a bigger deal there. Inside our lab system, not so much. We're a mix here of civilians and enlisted members, and I'm one of only, I don't know, maybe 30 or so enlisted members in a division of 260 or so people. So none of the civilians are required to take any of those classes, and even the enlisted members in forensic science have had very little of that formal training.
Okay, you may have answered some of these. It says you went over a few general examples in your presentation, but what are some of the crime scene scenarios you used with your team?
So I'll try to remember, well, I know the premise, and I'll try to remember some of the complications. So the crime scene scenario that we laid out was, well, let me back up for context. Each of our laboratories, and we're regionally spread around the state. Each of the laboratories has a sort of a crime scene service area. So when there's a homicide or a other kind of serious crime against person, one of our laboratories will respond with a team of 2 or 3 or sometimes up to 5 people and handle the physical evidence of that scene collection and documentation. What I did for this scenario, though, and the reason this came up was we had a discussion about what we would do if there was a scene that was prolonged. Maybe it takes 14 or 15 hours to accomplish because it's spread over a large geographic area, or it's very complicated in some way. And then secondly, what if it's sort of on the border between labs in those service areas? The service areas for us aren't really a hard line construction. They're just sort of a guideline. But what if we put one out there right at the edge? How would we handle those things? So for us, the scenario I mapped out was actually a shooting at a university in a dorm, in a dorm room initially. So we send one crew to a dorm room. It's essentially a small room in a hallway. And then while that crew is on scene, the shooter becomes active in another part of campus and is moving around campus now. And then, I think I complicated it to the point of one of our enlisted members on the crime scene crew actually ran into the suspect in a stairwell and engaged in a gunfight. So now what are we going to do? Because now that crew is compromised. And so that was how we did that, how we executed that scenario. Really just to take a normal crime scene and make it as abnormal and twisted as we could to try to see how we can handle, I guess, things that we normally would not see or have not seen.
Okay, a couple more here. I think we're going to wrap up soon. How do you determine if the exercise was a success?
Good question. For me, if everyone, so you can sort of measure how involved everyone is, right? Or how interested people are. For me, the success is in seeing everyone get engaged and really start to pitch in and throw out ideas and and contradict each other, in a professional way, and offer better solutions, and try to come up with the best outcome for the division as a whole, for all of us. So again, there isn't like a score or something we come up with at the end. There's nothing like that. It's literally just seeing people engage and think about it. I've also had a couple of times now, one of our lab directors, sort of participates in one of these exercises and then goes back to their work site and does something similar with their team, with their management team at the lab. Or they take one of the ideas that we literally worked on in the exercise and they go to their team at the lab and run the same thing, exactly the same thing by them right away, to see how they handle it locally, just to sort of firm up, the decision making at the laboratory level too. So to me, that's good stuff. If people participate and are interested enough, like it enough to take it back to their own people and run it, then that's probably pretty well received.
Yeah, no doubt. So I've got one question here. It kind of relates to the first question we asked. It says, can you expand a little on the need for scribing the decision? Does anyone capture the situation, decisions, and brief rationale to track thought process by the staff? And you might have indicated that's not memorialized, but is there some sort of scribe there picking out key points or anything like that?
We have, yes. We've had in a couple of exercises, at least, we've had a couple of moments where we've stopped and said, man, someone should write that piece down at least. Let's remember that for later so we can talk about it. The complex IT failure, the computer failure that I outlined for you, at the end of that one, or actually partway through that one, our quality assurance team especially started to realize, oh man, we don't even have the forms. We don't even have paper forms anymore that we could fall back to. And especially if you take away the whole computer, we can't even fall back to Excel and Word and that kind of stuff. So someone stopped and made notes about that. Now, have we acted on that? Maybe not entirely yet, but we recognize there's a deficiency there, and that if that scenario plays out for us, we've got some work to do to come up with, if we want to keep the operation running, we need things like worksheets, and we need a way to produce reports and a way to keep track of all that data that's collected. So someone made notes about those things, and that happens once in a while. We realize there's a deficiency, and we'll make a comment about that, or note a comment about that to follow up on for later.
Very good. Well, let me say I appreciate all the great questions that we got, and John, you did a great job responding to those questions. If there are no further questions, we're going to go ahead and close out today's webinar. Thank you so much for being here with us today, and please feel free to reach out if you have any further questions. And thanks again, John.
Thank you.
Before you leave today's webinar, please participate in our short 5-minute survey. Simply click the checkbox icon directly above the chat to access the audience feedback survey for today's event. Your feedback is critical information that helps us improve our webinars and continue providing the best experience possible. We would greatly appreciate it. Lastly, across the top of the live stream window are links to our social media profiles, including Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook. There is also a link to the FDCOE website, the Just Science podcast, and the FDCOE newsletter registration. Like, follow, or subscribe to stay up to date with everything the FDCOE is doing in support of the forensic community. Thank you again for attending, and we hope everyone has a great day.